5 years after the recession, every single capital city had property prices higher than the beginning of the recession. And then we come to the GFC, and we see similarly there for most capital cities for most years, property prices went up, but 5 years after the GFC, all property prices in all capital cities were higher than when the GFC first hit. So what it tells me, sorry, Bushy, that was a long way of saying in 10 words or less, Australian residential property prices are very resilient.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested. Hi, freedom fighters. Are you a contrarian? What does that even mean? And why is now a great time to become a contrarian investor? Well, a contrarian is an individual who acts in opposition to the majority. Someone who swims against the tide of popular opinion. Now, I've always been somewhat of a contrarian investor myself. I've always been more interested in facts and data over popular but often fictional, unfounded opinions. And in our day and age where opinions abound and facts are very rare to come by, the old saying that wise people speak when they have something to say, but fools speak because they have to say something, is becoming much more true every day. Now, as a contrarian, I'm more interested in what is likely to happen in the future based on leading data indicators rather than what has just happened. I strap on the future virtual reality glasses instead of driving while constantly staring out of the rearview mirror. In this sense, contrarian investing means to invest against the crowd and to be sceptical of general popular sentiment. It's an investing approach that rewards patience, confidence, and rationality with high returns. And it's a strategy that most of history's world-class investors have applied, like Warren Buffett. Paraphrasing him, Buffett says that most people get interested in investing when everyone else is. The time to get interested is when no one else is. And in my view, for an increasingly small window of time, that time is now. As Buffett goes on to say, to become rich, you need to be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. We have a small amount of time left to be greedy. Now, I need to reiterate that I'm not trying to sell you anything here. It makes no difference to me if you heed my signals or not. I just don't want you to miss out. Over the course of my 35 years in the industry, where I've lived through many cycles, I can tell you now that what I'm seeing coming only occurs about once in a generation, when all of the growth drivers and property planets align, and the perfect property eclipse is just around the corner. So I don't want you to miss out and then kick yourself later. I want you to be one of the one and one of the few that says, thanks heaven I did by seizing this rare opportunity, and not be one of the many who lament saying, if only I did in a couple of years' time. And if you're listening to this episode along with the last few episodes in times to come, pay close attention to identify all of the key drivers of growth so that you can take advantage of these universal laws and lessons again when the next property eclipse comes together, because it will, It's just a matter of how many years this is going to take. In this regard, I feel a little bit like Noah building the ark and letting everyone know that they need to jump on the boat before the flood starts. While many people fail to heed the signal because they still believe that this isn't the time, and they mistakenly think that they've got plenty of time. Don't kid yourself. This is actually one of those rare times when my age and experience actually pay dividends. I've seen these conditions come and go quickly in the past, so ignore the message at your own cost. And I also need to say at this point that I'm not giving you financial advice, just my own opinions of what I'm seeing. So make sure you get independent professional advice to suit your situation and circumstance before you do anything. Feel free to email me here at bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au, and our team will point you in the right direction to get you the help you need to make fully informed decisions that suit your sleep at night factor before you do anything at all. So before I paint a further picture of what is likely to happen when and where with property across Australia in the short to medium term, let's dig a bit deeper into the contrarian world of property investment. Now, in her blog, How to Be a Contrarian Property Investor, Monique Wakeland commented that this has been a year in which many prospective investors are carrying some real baggage, and who can blame them? The interesting thing I've observed in my decades in property investment is how markedly different people react when the mood changes. For many, the world is always about to end and nothing's going to be salvaged. Even though these people are the same ones who keep telling me how easy it's going to be to make a fortune when things are at the top of the cycle. A few arm themselves with the facts and ignore the daily news because they've got the big picture in mind and the sun will always shine. Most interesting of all, though, are the contrarian investors. No matter what the rest of the world is doing, contrarians see opportunity where others fear disaster. So when the investor herd is up and running, the contrarians swim against the tide. As famous investor John Templeton once said, if you want to have a better performance than the crowd, you must do things differently from the crowd. And he prophetically went on to say that growth markets are born in pessimism, grow on skepticism, mature on optimism, and die on euphoria. The time of maximum pessimism is the best time to buy. And again, that time is now, just. Now, at first glance, you might be mistaken for thinking that contrarian property investing seems to be all about market timing. But in reality, the genius is to look past current sentiment and concentrate on what really matters. And it works time after time, no matter how bad the headlines are, because despite all the opinions being bandied about during any phase of property cycles, the decisions that matter are not only when you buy, but what you buy where, and, most importantly, how long you hold it. Because the best time to buy is every time you can afford to. It's just the location around the nation that's going to vary. To better understand the contrarian mindset, let me touch on my history of some of my property investments. My first entree into property was way back in the mid-1980s, and yeah, I know I'm starting to show my age now. I'd saved about 20 grand and I wanted to invest. I was by no means wealthy, and I didn't have a particularly well-paid job as a struggling architect. What I did have, though, was an unemotional approach to investing and an openness to learning and taking advice from other successful investors. Now, who in their right mind was buying property back in 1985? That was the year capital gains tax was introduced and negative gearing was quarantined. The headlines were saying mass exodus from the property market, but I wasn't deterred. My first property was in Alice Springs, where I was working at the time, and I secured it for under 100 grand. Just as well, because negative gearing was reintroduced and property values soared. Today it's worth 4 times that. In 1992, in the depths of the then Prime Minister Paul Keating's recession that we had to have, with high interest rates and rising inflation, I bought a rental home in Glynde in South Australia for just over 100k. Again, it's now worth 4 times that. And remember the late 1990s? We were in a boom.com share market and people were saying, don't buy property. Interest rates were going to go up and the GST was being introduced. That year, we paid $84,000 for a 3-bedroom home at Aldinga Beach in South Australia, and it's now worth 5 times that. Our next purchase was around 2002. And if you believe the conventional wisdom of the timing, it was all wrong again. There was talk of a so-called property bubble, and the market was about to go belly up. A UBS Warburg report at the time predicted that property prices would fall by up to 36% right across Australia. Well, amid all that commotion, we bought a home in Huntfield Heights, and the property has increased substantially in value, and we subdivided the corner location to create a second property. And a number of other new build properties then followed. Jumping forward to after the GFC in the late noughties, we jumped on a plane and headed over to the US amongst all of the gloom and doom and picked up 3 rental homes very cheaply along the east coast of America that have all more than doubled in value. Over the years, as focused contrarian investors, we weren't spooked by economic, investment or political cycles, nor disturbed by alarmist commentary. We just bought and built every time we could afford to. Our portfolio simply consists of properties with the right features located in the right areas where demand from home buyers, investors and renters continually outstrips supply. They are merely money boxes in the shape of houses. And today, property values around the country have all just moved back into positive territory, despite the continued impending doom depicted in the newspapers and the TV news. What property investors do need to know is that property has now become multi-layered and multi-speed, and property values have stopped performing uniformly by type and location, and they'll never be uniform again. A rising tide varies by location, and it won't float all boats. And unfortunately, many first-timers start investing with a bargain mentality and are often induced by tax breaks, accelerated depreciation schedules and rental guarantees, and end up securing inferior properties in locations that produce very little growth. And as I said before, many other investors buy a property just like the one they live in, typically towards the end of a peak performance phase. These people have been turned on by the talk of booms and figure if their house has gone up in value, then surely another one just like it is going to as well. All too often, these investors find themselves with values retreating, both on their investment property and the home, just a few years after their investment on what was supposed to be a sure thing. What I suggest people to do, day in, day out, is to invest in the same way as contrarian investors. Get sound independent advice and buy and build quality properties in the right locations where they can always be rented out and will always appreciate overall, despite recessions, inflation outbreaks, share market crashes, subprime crises, or contagions. And in the current climate, the smart contrarians are starting to pounce. But it's not easy being a contrarian investor. It's far too easy to be swept up by the sentiment, whether it's euphoria or despair. Sentiment is contagious and you just can't escape it. You'll get infected when you read the newspapers, watch the news, or chat over lunch with your colleagues. This is the real contagion at work. But here's the start of the good news. As Richard Wakelin recently commented in his blog on the contrarian buy signal for property, there's a statistical trend now that is optimistic, even as we cautiously emerge from these curious pandemic times. Gross rental yields, which is income from rent divided by the property value expressed as a percentage, have been drifting downwards. They currently sit at a skinny 3.3% for houses across our capital cities, according to CoreLogic. 12 months ago, the corresponding number was about 3.6%, so a drop of 0.3%. Now, the mathematical reason is, of course, that due to the property price growth, it's been outpacing rent increases. On its own, without any further context, this seems like more of a disincentive to invest in property. However, looking at borrowing costs over the year, borrowers are now paying over 1% less with the rate drops. And as interest payments are the most significant cost of property investment, more of the holding costs are now being covered today compared to a year ago despite weak rental growth. This very narrow gap between gross rental yields and mortgage interest rates is actually a buy signal for investors. That's because investors require less cash flow from their disposable income to finance an investment, which means greater borrowing capacity and, in time, higher prices. Now, few people are attuned to this signal. Those contrarian investors with better antennas could profit now. That doesn't mean, however, that investment success is assured. Prospective investors must still overcome the comparatively tough borrowing criteria set for them, as well as the broader issue of banks struggling with mortgage application backlogs that's likely to continue until March, when the lending laws are being slated to relax. More fundamentally, as this exercise above illustrates, low rental yields are a reality of property investment. So investors should continue to focus on finding those quality property assets that deliver good long-term return through capital growth rather than through rental dollars. So while contrarian investing is not easy and requires courage and conviction, armed with the right insights and analysis, you can maximise your investment returns over the long term through multiple property cycles. Now, in my experience, there's always been and always will be a myriad of reasons and excuses that you can come up with on why now is never the right time to invest. And an investment opportunity will never be perfect, but you don't need perfect. You just need to take the plunge with a quality location, with a quality property, supported by the key growth drivers, and then just let time, the tenant and the tax office do the heavy lifting. And we're just coming out of the doldrums into the winds of growth. However, before we start looking at future property price predictions, let's take a minute to consider why property values didn't crash as they were predicted to at the onset of COVID-19. Eliza Owen, the head of research at Koulizos, has recently released an interesting report that explains why Australian property values have held up so well in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm going to paraphrase that now. 2020 has been a devastating year for many households and small businesses. As Australia moves through its first recession in over 28 years, ABS payroll data suggests that wages are down 4.3% from March to the end of October. In the same period, payroll jobs decreased 3%. At the onset of the pandemic, and consensus seemed to be building that the national decline in property values could reach 10%, with worst-case scenarios suggesting prices could fall by as much as a third, or over 30%. But between March and October, Australian home values have fallen just 1.7%. In fact, October marked a 0.4% increase in values, with a trend over November suggesting a further acceleration in growth. Although housing values are once again rising, it's important to highlight that Melbourne housing values remain around 5.4% below their recent high, and Sydney housing values are still 4.8% below their 2017 peak. Values in Perth and Darwin are more than 20% below their 2014 peaks, while the remaining capital cities have actually seen housing values move to new record highs through the COVID period. As Australia enters the start of a gradual recovery from the largest economic downturn since the 1930s, how can this be reconciled with such a mild downturn in property values? Well, a few factors that may explain the relative stability in housing at a high level will now be discussed. Firstly, low-cost debt. The cost of borrowing money is probably one of the most important factors influencing property values. Over 2020, the Reserve Bank have reduced the official cash rate target, which influences bank lending rates, by 0.65%, down to just 0.1%. In a bid to stimulate economic activity, the reduced cash rate has lowered bank funding costs, leading to record low mortgage rates. This relationship has held up historically, with RBA research previously suggesting that a 1% reduction in the cash rate can lead to an 8% increase in property values over the following 2 years. Now, keep this in mind when we look at price predictions shortly. In fact, it's not uncommon for housing markets to increase in value during negative economic shocks or periods of rising unemployment. This is because the monetary response to rising unemployment and falling consumption is often to lower the price of debt. Those that still have a secure income during these shocks may then be more inclined to borrow and buy as a result. Secondly, mortgage repayment deferrals. The Australian household debt to income ratio is an eye-watering 185%. This high level of debt is a vulnerability amid severe economic contractions because sudden job losses reduce the ability of households to service this debt. In the April Financial Stability Review, the RBA highlighted that each 1% increase in the unemployment rate could lead to an 8% increase in the portion of mortgages in arrears. In the case of large-scale mortgage debt, ongoing arrears can lead to forced sales, which in turn fuel risks associated with higher supply in the housing market, lower values, and higher rates of negative equity, where the borrower is forced to sell the property for less than what they owe the bank. Mortgage repayment deferrals have acted as a temporary stopper on this vicious cycle. Those that didn't want to sell amid economic uncertainty due to an inability to repay their mortgage just didn't have to. This may have contributed to very low levels of stock throughout 2020, which only reduced further amid Stage 2 restrictions from March. The low level of stock on market likely helped to insulate dwelling values during this time. Now, the April Financial Stability Review also noted that over half of owner-occupiers with a mortgage had at least 3 months of prepayments on their mortgage. Indebted households are further supported by their record low cash rate, which is lowering the cost of servicing debt as incomes have fallen. APRA data on loan deferrals shows that borrowers are becoming less dependent on these policies. As jobs and incomes slowly recover across the economy, the portion of housing loans deferred has come down from a peak of 11% in May to just 7% in September. More recent updates from lenders indicate that the number of mortgages on deferral arrangements fell sharply through October and November. Continued leniency for mortgage repayment deferral, particularly for owner-occupiers, is in the interest of the banking sector and extends the bridge to recovery as the economy gradually recovers. It's worth noting that indebted households do ultimately have to pay for mortgage repayment holidays, with unpaid interest capitalising on their loans, which means it gets added to their loans. These households will be further indebted down the line, which may constrain their future consumption, particularly in the event of another shock to the economy. For now, however, it's a policy which has helped to stave off further deterioration in housing markets. Thirdly, this economic downturn was very different. An important factor that may have insulated parts of the housing market is the specific nature of the economic downturn. Severe job loss across hospitality, tourism and the arts resulted from the purposeful and deliberate slowdown of social consumption. This meant that those working in food and accommodation and arts and recreation have seen devastating job loss through the pandemic. However, those working in this industry are less likely to have mortgage debt. The decline of employment in these sectors likely contributed to severe pockets of rental income decline, but the investor servicing the debt may be able to hold on to the asset while it's temporarily vacant. It's worth noting that prolonged declines in rental markets do ultimately pose a risk to values. An example is inner city Melbourne, which has had high exposure to rental demand from overseas migrants. Median asking rent values across the Melbourne market have fallen 24.2% between March and October. This highlights reopening international travel and migration as a key part of bolstering rental income from property. Number 4, housing markets did not hold up everywhere. Now, what we've just talked about in relation to the factors may have contributed to stability in the housing market at an overall aggregate level in the face of COVID-19. The many sub-areas and sub-markets that make up the so-called Australian property market still, however, add complexity in evaluating its performance. There have in fact been significant corrections in property values since March, such as the inner east of Melbourne, which actually fell 9.6% in value over that period. COVID-19 has affected property markets, but severe loss in housing values has so far been contained. Looking forward, despite further reductions in fiscal support from the government, dwelling values are likely to continue rising off the back of the November cash rate reduction, converging with a recovery in consumer sentiment and economic conditions. A strong institutional response and the manufactured nature of the current downturn has moderated the impact of COVID-19 on the housing market, and it will be further buoyed by the ongoing containment of the virus. It's worth noting that at the time of this recording in early December 2020, that the Reserve Bank Deputy Governor Guy Debelle has actually declared that Australia is technically out of recession. The recession that we decided to have is officially over. Now, this is quite simply an amazing feat by the federal and state governments in the face of incredible overnight pressure. So the big question now, though, is what's going to happen with property values around Australia moving forward? Again, this is where we need to turn to trusted independent research houses that conduct exhaustive research and undertake projections using multi-layered algorithm models across a whole raft of different scenarios. So today, in addition to the recent forecast by Property Predictions and BIS Oxford Economics that I've mentioned in the last couple of episodes, we're going to run through the key predictions outlined in SQM Research's just released Housing Boom and Bust report for 2021. And we're going to put in a contrarian lens. In short, all Australian cities are predicted to record dwelling price rises in 2021. And JobKeeper and quantitative easing by the RBA are going to be critical to the continued recovery. Australian capital city dwelling prices will rise in 2021 as a result of this year's aggressive government stimulus, interest rate cuts, and the upcoming changes to responsible lending laws, all according to Lewis Christopher of SQM Research. The base case forecast is for dwelling prices to rise between 5 to 9%, with the city of Perth to be the outperformer over the next year, followed closely by Brisbane, Sydney and Adelaide. The base case forecasts assume ongoing support from the federal government and the Reserve Bank over 2021. The forecasts also assume a progressive rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine and the potential for a third wave of the virus. Importantly, an extension of JobKeeper is regarded as absolutely essential for the ongoing momentum of the housing recovery, which appears to have formed from the end of September 2020. If JobKeeper is scaled back too prematurely, the housing market recovery in Sydney and Melbourne would stall. Perth is forecasted to rise between 8 to 12% on the back of an ongoing recovery in the base commodities market, further encouraging mining-based project investment. There now exists a significant shortage of Perth rental properties, which translated into a greater than 9% rise in market rents over 2020. This shortage is very likely to translate into even faster rent increases and stronger buyer activity in 2021. Melbourne is forecast to rise at a more subdued rate of just 2 to 6%, due in part to the extended lockdowns in 2020, destroying many small businesses and so likely delaying a jobs recovery. The ongoing international border closures, combined now with evidence of current interstate migration outflows, will also put Melbourne at a disadvantage. Nevertheless, rate cuts as well as state and federal government stimulus will put a floor underneath the Melbourne market for houses. CBD units are expected to record ongoing price declines. Leading indicators such as auction clearance rates and asking prices for Sydney are suggesting a forming recovery in the middle and outer rings. Inner city units continue to record price falls, for which we don't expect this trend to change. The overall Sydney forecast is for a 7 to 11% dwelling price increase. The proposed New South Wales stamp duty and land tax opt-out for home buyers will also be a stimulatory impact on the housing market next year. Again, Louis Christopher, Managing Director of SQM Research, said that as 2020 draws to a close, the national housing market has responded to the unprecedented economic stimulus packages as well as record low lending rates. Auction clearance rates have lifted since mid-year, and various dwelling price measurements have started to record price rises. It's likely that the housing market will gain further momentum on the back of increased investor activity. Now, we need to keep in mind that these projections are based on unemployment remaining elevated, and net migration is expected to be negative next year. There is also a surplus of inner-city units in our largest two cities. And it's also worth noting that if there were another negative macro event in 2021, there's not much room left to cut lending rates any further. Now, SQM Research, who've got a great track record of accuracy in their forecasts, have produced 4 different scenarios based on varying underlying conditions, with the likely base case revolving around the cash rate remaining unchanged at 0.1%, the ongoing quantitative easing. They've included allowance for a third COVID-19 wave contained via more lockdowns. They've assumed that JobKeeper is extended to September 2021 and that there's a progressive rollout of a COVID vaccine. Now, based on this, going around the grounds, projected growth for each Australian capital city is as follows. Perth is anticipated to grow by 8 to 12%, Brisbane by 4 to 8%, Darwin by 6 to 9%, Melbourne by 2 to 6%, Sydney by 7 to 11%, Adelaide by 6 to 10%, Hobart by 3 to 7%, and Canberra by 5 to 9%, with a weighted overall capital city average of between 5 to 9%. Now, if you want to get a PDF copy of the SQM Research Boom and Bust Report summary, feel free to email me at bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au and we'll email it back to you. Now, these are very strong predictions with no red ink anywhere, and, adopting my contrarian glasses, represent a great time to invest now prior to the lending law relaxation in March and the potential opening of international borders later next year. As Monish Pabrai famously said, investors sometimes get confused between risk and uncertainty, and you can profit handsomely from that confusion. The low-risk, high-uncertainty situation gives us our most sought-after opportunities, and that's ringing true right now. Now, hopefully you share my excitement with the rare area that we're flying in, but don't kid yourself that you can wait too long, as price rises are already on the move for good properties in good areas. To give you added clarity and confidence, this is further supported by discussions with other leading property industry thought leaders and active investors on today's podcast, where I continue my new role as co-host of Australia's leading and most popular property show on Kevin Turner's Real Estate Talk on realty.com.au, so feel free to check it out. During today's episode, I talk with the property professor and chairman of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, Peter Koulizos, and we talk about property performance post-recessions and what it might mean post-COVID-19. We chat with Stuart Weymss of ProSolutions about the increasing impact of finance on future property values. I had a personal discussion about the impact of lending law reforms and the added protection finance brokers will give property purchase and borrowers through the new best interest duty legislation that comes in on the 1st of January. And this is in stark contrast to some of the premature concerns that are being expressed by some of the consumer groups. And we close with another great chat with Pete Wargent of Buyers on how property buyers can better negotiate in tight rising property markets. So what does all this mean to you now, and what should you be doing about it? Well, I'm suggesting that you join the ranks of contrarian investors like myself and take the plunge before the property train leaves the station. If you're still not sure and you need more knowledge to give you comfort, clarity and confidence, grab a free copy of my award-winning book, Get Invested, as a precursor to the step-by-step guide to successful property investing outlined in my book, The Freedom Formula, which you can grab off our website at www.knowhowproperty.com.au or bushymartin.com.au. Or if you don't have time to read, you're welcome to come and join me on our next free online live interactive Zoom information session. Just email me directly at bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au and our team will get you booked in. In the meantime, get further inspired with these great chats with the property professor, Stuart Weymss and Pete Wargent.
Welcome everyone. It's time for this week's awesome real estate talk show. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance, and I'm filling Kevin Turner's massive shoes again this week in hosting this week's episode, and we're in for some really action-packed and great guests today. So we'll be drilling into subjects for as far and wide as recessions, through to reform, through to revolutions, and we'll be talking with interested leaders, Peter Koulizos, Stuart Weymss and Pete Wargent. So we've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. And we're going to start by looking at the facts versus the fiction in terms of property performance following recessions and what this means to us post-COVID. And it's fair to say that since the pandemic, there's been a lot of gloom and doom predictions in the press. But do the facts actually line up with the fiction? So to discuss this, I'm joined by the Chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia and our resident property professor, Peter Koulizos. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you, Bushy, for the invitation. Much appreciated. How are you, my friend?
Very good, mate. Always good to see you, a fellow Adelaidean.
Yeah.
Mate, there's some interesting things happening around the place, and there's always a big difference between perception and reality. So, and I've always said that what we generally learn from history is that we don't learn from history. So let's start by seeing what has actually happened to residential property prices in past recessions, Peter, if you can share that with us.
Sure. So I did some research a few months ago when COVID-19 first hit, just so I could get an understanding of what's happened to residential property prices in the past when we've had major economic hits. So I looked at so we had 1970s, we had a recession, 1980s, 1990s. The global financial crisis didn't result in a recession, but it was certainly a financial hit. So if we look at the 1970s recession, and what I did here, Bushy, was look at the 2 years where the recession took place and then the 5 years afterwards.
Great.
So for the 1970s recession, I looked at all the major capital cities for that 7-year period, and there was not 1 year where residential property prices dropped. And then I looked at the 1980s recession, and out of all the major capital cities over 7 years, so we're looking at 56 data points, there was only 1 year where property prices dropped in Perth by 1.7%. So for all the other 55 data points, we had increases in property prices.
Right.
Now, the 1990s recession was a little bit different, Bushy. Now, you and I are a very similar age, so we remember the 1990s recession quite well.
The recession that we had to have, Peter. Yes, I do.
That's the one. And not only did we have the recession, but in South Australia, our State Bank of South Australia collapsed. In Victoria, their pyramid building society collapsed. So we had a number of compounding factors. So the 1990s recession did see most capital cities have at least 1 year where property prices fell. But 5 years after the recession, every single capital city had property prices higher than the beginning of the recession. And then we come to the GFC, and we see similarly there, for most capital cities for most years, property prices went up, but 5 years after the GFC, all property prices in all capital cities were higher than when the GFC first hit. So what it tells me, sorry, Bushy, that was a long way of saying in 10 words or less, Australian residential property prices are very resilient.
Well, it's really good graphical evidence of the facts again versus the fiction and the doom and gloom that the media likes to paint around these sort of uncertain times. Given that history then, Peter, what's your thoughts around what you think's going to happen to residential property values post the current COVID contagion?
Oh, so we've already seen, Bushy, that 6 out of the 8 capital cities have already had property prices increase. Sydney and Melbourne, where they had the most severe lockdowns, are still in negative territory, but it won't be long before they turn around. And one of the main reasons this time around, as has been the case for the other recessions and the GFC, Bushy, is price is a function of demand and supply. So what we've had is very little supply. So admittedly, there's not as many people interested in buying property during a time like this, but there's a lot less people interested in selling their property. So with very limited stock, it looks like there's a lot of people out there buying, but for example, in a suburb where there might be 10 open inspections and you might expect 10 people at each one, there's only 3 open inspections and 15 at each one. So there's only about half the people out and about looking, but there's 30% of the supply out there. So what we've seen is property prices going up, and with lending restrictions changing in March next year, we are going to see property prices increase even more.
Yeah, it's 100% agree. Let's have a look at the commercial side of things for a minute, because certainly, again, the press has been giving the commercial sector a bit of a hard time in recent times with their predictions around what's going to happen in that sector. What's your view on the post-COVID performance of commercial property?
Okay, so here the media is a little bit closer to the truth than they are with residential property. Retail property has really taken a hit since the GFC. And bricks and mortar retail has really suffered. Online retail is really doing well. So owners of retail property will have to look at maybe reconfiguring their properties, like having a smaller footprint or smaller spaces to lease rather than one large space. Commercial property, well, we've seen COVID-19 and working from home, we're already seeing companies either reducing the amount of office space they need or not renewing their leases. So I think that's going to impact. So maybe owners of office property need to look at co-working options. Again, smaller leasing space or smaller footprint. But I think the one area of commercial property that is going to do well is industrial and warehousing, because we've gone from many, many years ago to storing lots of stuff in warehouses, and we needed lots of warehouses. And then we went to something called just-in-time delivery, where we only had a minimal amount in warehouses. But now, due to COVID-19, we're going to move to something called just-in-case warehousing. So especially if you're waiting for goods from interstate or more specifically overseas, you want to make sure that you've got a sure supply of your stock sitting there in the warehouse. So I certainly see some opportunities in warehousing, but vendors of office space and retail space are going to have to think outside the square.
Mate, some really good insights there. And what I love about that in periods of change, there's always opportunity. That's where, investors like ourselves and reading those insights and then positioning ourselves and really take advantage of it. Mate, really always enjoy your very clever insights into what's happening, what's likely to happen. Mate, how can listeners find out a bit more about PIPA or the Property Investment Professionals of Australia if they're interested in talking further, finding out more and or engaging a qualified and certified PIPA professional to assist them in their property needs?
Yeah, so if they go to the website, pipa.asn.au, they'll find lots of information, including some videos, one on just the topic that we're talking about, which is what's happened to property prices in post-economic shocks. And I 100% agree with you, Bushy. If you're looking for a property professional, ensure that they are a PIPA member. And if you're looking for quality property investment advice, find yourself a QPIA, a qualified property investment advisor. The main reason that we were founded is to try and get rid of all the cowboys in the property investment industry. So the more and more people can seek out PIPA members, qualified property investment advisors, the less and less we're going to have people being sucked in by these property cowboys.
Absolutely right. Always like talking to you, Peter. Thanks for coming on board again today. After the break, guys, we're joined by the walking encyclopedia of property and finance, Stuart Weymss, to discuss the impact of finance on property values moving forward. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Property deductions can save you thousands of dollars each year. To make sure you maximise deductions, you need to work with the most experienced quantity surveyor in the country. BMT Tax Depreciation is the leading specialist in the industry. They've completed over 700,000 tax deduction schedules for residential investment and commercial properties Australia-wide. BMT guarantee to find double your fee in the first full financial year deductions. Call BMT on 1300 728 726 today for an obligation-free quote.
Welcome back. Now, those of you who know me will have heard me say many times that property is a game of finance. And there's no doubt that access to credit has a very significant impact on property values, which has been evidenced over time. Now, we've seen a recent rate drop, and there are significant proposed changes to the lending laws that are coming up next year. So to discuss this and its potential impact, I'm joined by Stuart Weymss from ProSolutions and the author of his most recent book, The Rules of Lending, which is Rules of the Lending Game, which is very appropriate to the discussion we're going to have today. So welcome back, Stuart.
Great to be with you, Bushy. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, always. Now, mate, you've recently investigated the link between lending volumes and property price growth. What did you find?
I found that there was a positive correlation, a pretty strong positive correlation, which probably shouldn't surprise us too much. Logic would tell us that if there's more loans being approved, people have more money to spend, so demand is higher. And we know that property supply can't change very quickly, certainly not as quickly as demand can change. So if there's a large influx of money into the market through new approved loans, demand is increased, supply is probably the same. That typically translates into property price growth. So we've certainly seen that strong correlation, particularly over the last 10 or 15 years, and to a lesser extent, over time longer than that.
Yeah, Stuart, I know you've done some quite detailed investigation through this with a really interesting chart that really demonstrates the story. Can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to bring the chart up now. The blue line shows the mortgage volume. So that's really the new loans approved, excluding any refinance. Let's call that the new money flowing into the property market. The green line is the subsequent 3-year rolling annual growth rate, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's really to say if a whole bunch of money flows in this month, what happens subsequent to that occurring? And we can see that especially really since the early to late 2000s, there's a very strong positive correlation. It's a little off in the early 2000s, but certainly from mid-2000 onward. And you can see most recently, really from about 2016 odd, we've seen a reduction in loan volumes, which is really as a result of ASIC's credit tightening. And as a result, the growth rate coming off. So it makes sense that loan volumes is a good representation of demand. And when we see loan volumes tick up, we can take that as that demand has increased for property.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's sort of a long tail. On the flip side, when the credit tightens, we're seeing that there's a flow-on effect into property values over an extended period. So some really clear correlations there. But that sets up the scene beautifully for what we're likely to see in March next year with the proposed changes to lending laws that are likely to flow through then. What's your read on the impact these are going to have on buyers' borrowing capacities and investors in particular?
If the banks start using benchmark expenditure rates, which I suspect they will, obviously we don't have a lot of detail on how those changes are going to pan out, but essentially the court cases that Westpac were subject to, the judge said that your current expenditure levels don't really inform me as to your ability to make loan repayments. And we all know that I think we've all been in a situation where we've had this level of borrowings, and personally we've increased our borrowings when we thought, oh my God, I hope we can afford it, but you always find a way to do it. And obviously it's at the expense of discretionary expenditure. You would much prefer to make a repayment on your mortgage than go out for dinner tomorrow night. And so that's why your current expenditure level correct, doesn't really inform you. In fact, if you've got a large amount of discretionary expenditure there, perhaps that's the best evidence that you can afford to take on additional debt. So if the banks start using benchmark expenditure levels, which I said I think they will, then anyone really spending more than, say, $30,000 to $40,000 a year, which tends to be where the benchmark levels reside, is going to have a significant impact on borrowing capacity. So for people, say, with a family income of $200,000 and they're spending about $80,000 a year, on the current way of looking at serviceability, they probably have very limited borrowing capacity. But if we then say, if we assume they're not spending 80 grand, they're spending 40, that 40,000 reduction in living expenses goes directly towards borrowing capacity, and that will have a substantial impact. So it could be that we've got a client today that has no borrowing capacity or minimal, and in March or after March next year, potentially they can go and borrow another $500,000, $1 million. And it could be the difference between, someone not being able to add another property to their portfolio versus being able to add another property. So it could be substantial. In fact, I suspect it will be substantial, and I suspect it will increase the supply of money into the property market. And as a result, if history repeats itself, and it almost always does, we'll see some price growth.
Yeah, no question. And I think it's a twofold effect in that there's been people in recent times that you and I know are actually in a good position to be able to afford debt and haven't been able to. So they'll be able to cross that line to get into property, and there'll be others who you can actually buy more property as a result. So both of those together are collectively going to put fairly significant pressure on property prices. So it reinforces we're in a bit of a window of opportunity up until then. Given that, what's your thoughts on what buyers can do, and again, investors in particular, to position themselves to benefit from these proposed changes?
Pray that some common sense occurs, and that's exactly what occurs as we start using benchmark living expenses. And let's not forget, the banks have access to an amazing amount of data around what people are actually spending, and they can average that out. So they can build a good data set to support their assumptions. Pray that's going to occur. I guess the other side of the coin to serviceability, which really goes to the living expenses argument, and that's the thing that's really tightened over the last few years. So if that gets loosened off a little bit, we still need all the other prudential regulation and checks and so forth that have tightened up, and they're very robust, and they're okay. They should stay, but the living expense thing should change. But the other side of the coin is equity. So it's great to have increased serviceability, but if you don't have the equity to secure the borrowings, you're still going to be retarded in terms of your ability to build your portfolio. So that's what I would be focusing on if I was an investor. Where am I going to get the equity from? Are there any cosmetic improvements I can make to my property to make sure it values up nicely, following markets and comparable sales, and picking properties to revalue at particular times to kind of lock in that new revaluation. But I'd be keeping, the serviceability stuff, there's not much you and I have control over. It will be, we'll see how it ends up. But the equity side of things is where we do have some control. And I guess through COVID, there's been pressure on rents and ability to re-tenant properties and so forth. And I think it reminds us that we do need to spend a little bit of money on properties to keep them up to not only tenantable order, but really comparable to other properties in the location where our properties reside. So it makes sense to do that.
Yeah, some really good advice there. One of the things I'm going to suggest they do, Stuart, is to go out and buy your latest book, The Rules of the Lending Game. Having read it myself, all the preparation they need to do to take advantage of what's about to happen next year is right there in the hot little hands. Where can they get a copy, Stuart?
If they just Google Rules of Lending Game, you can certainly buy it online. You can go to ProSolutions, so my website, and buy it on there. And I think it makes an incredibly generous Christmas gift. So I don't disagree with you there, Bushy.
Now, just before we go to the break, I want to expand on some of the aspects of what I was talking about there with Stuart, because there appears to be some misconceptions that are floating around the what is likely to happen to lending laws in next March. And we're starting to see some of the consumer groups come out and express real concerns that the changes to the lending laws are going to allow predatory lending behaviour to come back into the marketplace. Now, while it's early days, it's important to recognise that these are reforms to responsible lending, not removing responsible lending. These are tweaks that are being inserted to try and avoid what started to occur where the pendulum has swung way too far, particularly over the last couple of years. Now, Stuart touched on it in relation to the forensic detail that goes into looking at your living expenses. And we've seen ridiculous cases where, under the current legislation, banks are being forced to query silly things like a $1 contribution on your payslip to the social club and having to produce a stat deck to prove it. We've seen situations where we've got credit assessors asking borrowers why they don't allow education expenses for a 1-year-old, as an example. Now, clearly it has gone too far. And this has bubbled through to the Treasurer, who recognises that we need to improve the flow of credit. So what he's looking to do is adjust the exercise to allow some common sense to come back into the equation. And a lot of this has flowed through from a recent court case that, again, Stuart touched on, which is affectionately referred to as the Wagyu and Shiraz case, where ASIC actually took Westpac to court because they claimed that using average benchmark living expenses was inappropriate. And after getting thrown out and then losing on appeal, what the presiding judge said was that just because I can afford to eat the best Wagyu steak and drink the highest quality Shiraz today doesn't mean that I won't adjust my behaviour once I've got a loan to be able to fulfill that obligation, which is a very common sense read of the true situation. So I just want to call for some calm in relation to the situation here. We're not likely to see everything thrown out. These are just adjustments to improve the correct flow of the borrowing application situation. And don't forget there is a raft of other protections that are in place and are coming in that will further protect borrowers to make sure they're being looked after. So we've got the Consumer Credit Code will still remain in place. And the big change that's coming in on the 1st of January is the best interest duty that all finance brokers will have to abide by. Now, there are 17 very clear legal obligations that finance brokers will have, and very significant penalties if they don't comply, in terms of making sure that whatever they do is in the best interest of the borrower. Now, what this means is that non-compliance could result in fines of in excess of $1 million if the broker doesn't do the right thing. Now, brokers currently bring about 60% of the loans to the banks. So one of the protections that you have as a borrower is to take advantage of that and use a finance broker to make sure that you're securing your loan, because they have an absolute onus to have to act on your behalf, no one else's. A bank can't do that because the bank's got to look after its own interests, obviously. But you can give yourself that extra layer of protection by making sure that you engage a savvy mortgage broker to look after your ongoing lending needs. So that's, I just wanted to put a little bit more colour around that. It's an important discussion, particularly given the level of consumer kickback that is starting to occur in the media. I just want to call for some calm in that. We'll keep you up to date with what's happening in that in future episodes of Real Estate Talk. And stay tuned after the break, because we'll be having a great conversation with Pete Wargent.
Property depreciation is the natural wear and tear of a building and its assets. Property investors can claim depreciation as a tax deduction each financial year. Depreciation is a non-cash deduction. This means you don't need to spend any money in order to claim it. On average, BMT tax depreciation fined residential investors almost $9,000 in first full financial year deductions. Call BMT on 1300 728 726 today for an obligation-free quote.
Welcome back. Now, despite ongoing media reports, we're seeing that good properties are actually hard to find, and buyers are actually having to pay more than expected to secure the few properties that are up for sale. Now, to discuss how buyers can better position themselves to find and secure properties, we're joined by the founder of the newly launched Buyers, which is a new national buyers agency business that's giving buyers access to an affordable panel of the best of the buyers agents around Australia. So welcome back, Pete.
Pleasure. Thanks, Bushy.
Mate, let's start with the money side, because that's where most people start in the whole property transaction, and it's obviously a keen interest of mine. How do you see buyers best positioning themselves and preparing themselves with their finances in relation to looking at buying a property?
Yeah, usually the best starting point is speak to either your bank or more often these days your mortgage broker, and it's worth bearing in mind that at the moment processing times can be quite slow. A lot of people have been refinancing their mortgages because of record low mortgage rates. So you need to be prepared well in advance, because it might take a little bit longer with some banks than is normally the case. But as you mentioned, it's been a pretty tight market this year, not much stock. So having mortgage pre-approval in place before you actually make an offer on a property is critical.
Yeah, very important first step, and saves a lot of time and makes you much more attractive to real estate agents and sellers in that regard. Now, let's start looking at the search side of the equation. So when you're looking at finding a good property, how can buyers best research the opportunities that they're looking to find?
Yeah, I think to begin with, it all comes down to research. You need to understand first and foremost what is your budget. Then that should help you narrow down onto location and the best areas that you can get into with your budget. And then it comes down to actually looking at recent comparable sales. Now, this year, as I mentioned, for a range of reasons, there haven't been as many sales as normal. So you might need to dig a little bit deeper in terms of finding the available information. So you might need access to a sales database rather than just scanning listing portals, because there are actually fewer transactions to compare with this year. And then the best way often to find properties when stock is tight is to get agents on site. So speak to some local real estate agents, because you may need to act quickly and decisively to get a property bought in this kind of a market when conditions are so tight.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. Well, let's say we've gone through the process and we've managed to find a property that we're pretty keen on. What we're seeing at the moment is good quality properties. Buyers are often getting pipped at the post by better offers that come out of left field. What negotiation tips can you suggest that buyers can take advantage of to improve their chances of securing the property, Pete?
Yeah, so you need to have an awareness of market conditions, because that will help you to act decisively when you find the right property. So if you've got a good idea of what the property is worth, and particularly if you can understand why the vendor is selling, then they'll put you in the best possible position. Now, I think when it comes to actually negotiating, it's important to know when to negotiate hard on a property price when dynamics are in your favour. But it's also important to know when not to push too hard, because one of the things I've seen a lot this year is people putting in offers saying, well, we've had a recession, we've had COVID, and therefore I'm going to offer much less than the asking price. And it just hasn't worked in a lot of situations, because the market has not declined as much as you might have expected in a recession. So I think know when to negotiate hard, but also not to push too hard in every circumstance. And don't be put off if your first offer is refused. If you're unfamiliar with the property purchase process, that's quite common, and it's very common for vendors to come back with a counter offer. Don't be put off by a refusal. That can often be the way the process works, and just try and keep calm and don't become too emotionally involved.
Yeah, very good advice. And I mean, a lot of people focus on price, but there are other things that you can throw into the consideration if you've got a better understanding of what the seller's needs are. Things like talking to the agent to find out whether the seller needs to stay there for a while before they buy the next property, and accommodating that to make that sound attractive. There's a whole heap of tips that you've shared with us in the past that have been very useful. Pete, I know you represent buyers and you have a national panel of the very best of the buyers agents around the country who are experts at assisting in buyers to find and negotiate properties. It's a very new and different approach to doing that. For those listeners who can see the merits in a very tight market in engaging a good buyer's agent to assist them, how can they take advantage of buyers, and what's the next step for them?
Yeah, you actually touched on an important point there, and that is that the purchase process in Australia, at least, is different in every state and territory. So understanding the local processes. So, for example, just to take Queensland as my home state, it's very common for people to make offers that are subject to finance and subject to building and pest inspections in Brisbane, for example, or southeast Queensland. That may not be the case for example, in Sydney, where the market is tight. So understanding the local process is key as well to your negotiation and preparedness. If you want a local buyer's agent on your side, we have a national panel that covers every state and territory. And what we do that's a little bit different, for buyers who already have an idea of where and what they want to buy, we have an entry-level product that probably comes in at about 1/3 of the price of a full buyer's agency service. So we have a suite of products for all circumstances and budgets. So best starting place, check out our website, buyersbuyers.com.au, and there's lots of information there. And if you're unsure, just drop us a line and we'll be more than happy to help out.
Yeah, brilliant. Having had a look at the site myself, there's a lot of market intelligence that they can take advantage of and delving into the facts and figures around a specific property. So I certainly recommend the listeners to have a good look at that. Mate, always enjoy your insights, Pete. It's a pleasure to have you back on board. And for everyone else, that's another wrap for Real Estate Talk this week. I'd like to thank Peter Koulizos, Stuart Weymss, and Pete Wargent for their generous insights and time today. I'm Bushy Martin from Know How Property Finance. If you want to hear a little bit more, feel free to join me on the Get Invested podcast to hear more from all of today's guests, plus all of the other industry leaders in the property and finance space. And on behalf of Kevin Turner and our whole team here at Real Estate Talk, we look forward to seeing you all next week.
Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. It's hello@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/getinvested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die